Okay, AP Psych class, we are on part 3 of Unit 8B, talking about experienced emotion. We know from previous readings and videos that our emotions are a combination of our physiology and our expressive outward behavior, but we also know that conscious experience plays a role. And so let's take a look at that in this video. First, the question to answer is, how many distinct emotions do we actually experience? Carol Izard did lots of observations of infants, and from the facial expressions that she observed, came to the conclusion that there are 10 basic emotions that we experience. She would argue that any other emotions that we feel are just simply a result of a combination of 2 or more of the 10 basic ones. And so a good example is love, to Carol Izard, is simply the combination of the basic emotions of joy plus interest, excitement. And so, even in infants, we see without any sort of learning that we kind of come pre-programmed with 10 basic emotions. How do we label those experienced emotions? We label them on a 2-dimensional scale known as the valence arousal scale. And so when we talk about valence, we're talking about how pleasant or unpleasant, how positive or negative an emotion is. And when we talk about arousal, we're talking about the intensity of that emotion, how low or high the intensity is. And so an example, if I am angry versus if I am enraged. Angry is going to be lower on the intensity dimension and probably also lower in valence, right? It's or higher in valence. It's more pleasant than enraged would be, especially if you're on the receiving end of my enraged attitude. Same thing. Scared is viewed as being different than terrified. And so when we analyze emotions, we can look at them using those 2 dimensions. Okay, so Myers uses 3 basic emotions as his examples of experienced emotions in this section: fear, anger, and happiness. So the first one, fear, 2 things we can know about fear. Fear is probably not only could be a learned response, but biology is also playing a role. And so think back to Unit 6 for learned response, either through conditioning, right, associating objects or events with things that are naturally painful or fearful, or observational learning, right, the work of Albert Bandura. There's actually been a lot of interesting research that monkeys can that have been raised in labs and have never themselves experienced a snake can learn to fear snakes by watching monkeys that were raised in the wild exhibit that fear response to a snake. And so observational learning works even in the world of monkeys. But biology is also playing a role. These monkeys, watching videos of wild monkeys in their fear of snakes, can learn to fear snakes through observational learning. But when researchers Photoshop in flowers over top of those snakes, the monkeys don't learn through observation to fear flowers. So obviously, think from an evolutionary psychology perspective, things that led to the survival of our species probably are more easily learned responses. So biology is going to play a role. The other way that biology plays a role is concerning genes, our genetic makeup, and that part of our brain in charge of emotions, the amygdala. And so we know that the amygdala is the key to linking the fear to the specific situation or the event. Individuals with damaged amygdalas don't show emotional response. They clearly might have learned the fear, but won't actually physically show the fear response without that amygdala. And so we actually have a scientific isolation of a gene that we know influences the amygdala, and that we know that people with a short version of that gene actually have less of a protein that's in charge of speeding up the reuptake of serotonin. And so that means people with the short version of this gene have more serotonin floating around in their synaptic caps, and in the amygdala that means it's more activated and they show a revved up response. And so freaking out or wigging out easily may be a result of a shortened version of that gene, and not having fast reuptake of serotonin. So kind of interesting. Anger is the other basic emotion used as an example in this section. We know that experiencing anger chronically can lead to a lot of physical health problems that we'll talk about in video 4. And we actually know that culturally, there are some cultures that experience anger more than others. Those collectivist cultures tend not to experience anger as much, probably because of the knowledge that experiencing it would decrease like the harmony of the overall group. And so in our individualized Western cultures, we tend to be the ones that experience anger the most. And so pop culture or popular psychology will often purport what's known as the catharsis hypothesis, that it is good to vent our feelings, that venting them make us feel less of that emotion. We know from the last video, however, that that's probably not true. We know that experiencing or expressing an emotion intensifies it. It can alter what it is we are feeling inside. And so other research has kind of supported that as well. We know that it really doesn't probably make you feel any better to do this. And one of the researchers that's done a lot of research on this in this field, Brad Bushman, I love, this is a paraphrase quote, but that venting is like using gasoline to put out a fire, that it doesn't make people feel less angry to do it. And the other danger in that is that could lead to learned behavior, right? Like when in these situations, this is the appropriate thing to do, like fly off the handle or get in someone's face or scream at them, which is going to lead to a lot of social ramifications as well. So just know that although pop psychology likes to talk about venting and getting things off your chest, that actually regular research in scientific research in the world of psychology will tell you probably not the best idea, that the catharsis hypothesis is probably not valid. So what's the suggestion when you feel angry? Wait. The intensity of the emotion is going to decrease without any outward expression of it. If you need to communicate with someone, you can be assertive, but you should be very clear. It shouldn't be emotion laden. It shouldn't be a teacher screaming like, "I can't believe you students don't blah, blah, blah." Instead, it should be very clear, like when you take something that does not belong to you off my desk, when you use my possessions without asking permission, it makes me feel very angry. There's a difference there. We also know that practicing acts of forgiveness are better for your overall physical health, and we'll discuss more of that in the stress and health video coming up to you next. The last emotion that's mentioned here is happiness. We don't know as much about happiness because, again, that positive psych movement is relatively new in the field of psychology, but the new research that is out is very fascinating. So it's listed below here. Remember, expressing an emotion intensifies it, so acting happy can make you feel happy. We also know from the research with the feel-good, do-good phenomenon that being in a happy mood is often makes you more likely to help others. We know from the work of Watson and Kahneman that overall our emotional peaks and valleys tend to balance out. So when you are given horrible news, like a person being told they have a debilitating disorder, rarely do they on the whole express like this wanting to die attitude. I mean, the news might be devastating and shocking at first, but you tend to adjust and have relatively balanced out emotions. And so the lesson from their research really is that people tend to overestimate the duration of our emotions, right? Like that feeling that, oh, I'll never get over this. And we tend to underestimate our capacity to adapt, that we're actually much more adaptable than we give ourselves credit for. A lot of fascinating research has been done in terms of wealth and happiness, because when you survey people, the vast majority of people will tell you that, yeah, if I only had more money, then I would be happier. But we actually know that that's only true to some extent. That think of your economics lessons, right? And like the law of diminishing marginal utility, that to a basic extent, wealth is important. And like that makes me always think of Maslow, right? Once your basic needs are met, wealth beyond that doesn't necessarily generate happiness. And so, yeah, if you're starving or homeless or in danger, yeah, if money could alleviate those situations, yes, that will make you happier. But as long as you are living a comfortable life, more money does not guarantee happiness. Actually, the obsessive pursuit of wealth, we know, decreases happiness. And on the flip side, we also know that just being happy can often lead to an increased income. So probably that whole pursuing your passion probably causes people to work harder and garner rewards as a result. So it's probably the reverse, that happiness causes wealth, not wealth causing happiness. Two other new vocab words related to the research in this field are adaptation level phenomenon, that we tend to judge things in terms of like a relative neutral level. And so like, let's say that I'm like, oh, if I only had more money, then like all my problems would be solved, and I get more money, I adjust to that new level. Like that new level becomes the norm. And then that leads me to, well, now if I only had more money, like I could fly my helicopter to work instead of driving in my, super, expensive import. You kind of get used to the level at which you are. And that kind of is why, wealth will only lead to happiness to a certain extent. Relative deprivation is also important to keep in mind as well, in that we tend to judge our own happiness by comparing ourselves, right, relative to other people's situations. And so how we view ourselves as being better or worse off than people can play a role. And so that's a good lesson in keeping things in perspective concerning happiness. That if you're constantly comparing yourself, like, oh, I don't have this, or this person has more than me and that's not fair, that can lead to decreased happiness. But then the flip side of that is, like, hey, I may not drive the coolest car or have the biggest mansion, but I have a home and I have a car, and lots of people in our society are without those sorts of things, can actually make you feel happier in terms of, putting things in perspective. So relative deprivation can work in both a positive way and, unfortunately, in a negative way. And so that's something important to keep in mind. So there are your examples of basic emotions concerning our experience or our conscious feelings about our feelings. And bring any questions that you have with you to class. As always, thanks for listening.